Hey, we're both rocking the Michigan after a resounding victory.
It's only
in the
natural.
Civil War. Yes, yes.
When you embarrass your little brother, you have to flaunt it in front of everybody.
Yes, you do. Are you ready, son?
I'm ready to go.
Hello, welcome to Hard Compound, an American take on Formula One. We finished watching the Mexico Grand Prix. It did not go as I expected. I had predicted a all Spanish-speaking podium. And unless Max and Lewis speak Spanish as their first language, I was incorrect, although that was a crazy prediction. We have a content-rich show for you. First, Patrick, son, can I get your take of the 2022 Mexico Grand Prix?
Yeah, I think for me, it was surprisingly bland. As far as Mexican Grand Prix go, Grands Prix, I guess is the plural. But, overall, a few kind of chaotic moments, some more domination by Red Bull and Max. And we got to see Checo on the podium again in his home Grand Prix. So lots of good and fun things to come out of it. We also saw some pretty interesting qualifying and sort of Ferrari acknowledging that they can't hang, coming down to the end of the season here. So I think lots of good storylines, but the race itself, there seemed to be really only one driver providing any action, and that happened to be Daniel Riccardo.
Yes. As they say in Mexico, it was a fait accompli. It just seemed that everything was known in advance and there were no surprises. Max is dominant. No one is in his league. The only one who seems to be able to stay close is Lewis Hamilton. In the Red Bull, Checo was able to get onto the podium. Mercedes continues to improve. Ferrari continues to falter. I think it was all the expected storylines. I hope everything there is okay. I think it was all the expected storylines, with the exception, as you said, of Daniel Ricciardo. I think a few episodes ago, I had sort of jokingly suggested Daniel go out like the aging football player in the old Bruce Willis movie Last Boy Scout, where he just slaughters everyone on his way to victory, And when he took out poor Yuki, I mean, Yuki's already having a bad enough season, and he took Yuki out. He gave Yuki no shot. I thought, hey, maybe this could come true, and Daniel's just going to go out like, in a sort of, Butch Cassidy and Sundance foolish blaze of glory. Not quite, but it was fun to see him do better than his teammate, do better than most of the grid.
Yeah, it was definitely exciting to see him kind of prove to everybody that he is capable of it. His time with McLaren has been pretty tough, but throughout his career, he's been a really good driver. And he has a lot of talent, and he's shown some good moments. And finally this season, unfortunately, the third to last race, it finally happened for him. But he showed that will to fight and that talent come through. And, when he found out he got that penalty, he just kind of put the pedal to the floor and went past as many guys as he could. So it was a lot of fun to see that. You do feel for Yuki. That AlphaTauri team has been horrible this season. They're still behind Haas, believe it or not. So that was tough for him. as far as the penalty goes, I'm, more pleased with a 10-second penalty than a 5-second penalty for taking out your opponent. But it's surprising to me that a week after George Russell takes out Carlos Sainz, the leader of the race, getting a 5-second penalty for that, they, give Daniel Ricciardo 10 seconds for taking out some guy in 12th place, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, maybe be a little bit more consistent, or come out, specifically saying this is the penalty that you get for taking out your competitor, right? Because right now they're all over the place, and I still don't think 10 seconds is even enough.
Yeah, we've talked about this before. If you can take out, especially if you can take out someone close to you in the standings, and George has done this with Carlos and with Sergio, and he's taken them out and only received a 5-second penalty. That is worth it. FIA is encouraging this behavior. You have made it extremely clear that it's worth trying to take out your rival on track. All you'll get is a 5-second penalty. This time, Daniel got a 10-second penalty. Didn't really matter, but that was, it was still, maybe I guess we should say that's an improvement over the 5-second. It's funny that you mentioned that, because over the week there has been such a kerfuffle because George took out Carlos, who had a real shot at victory last week, and all he got was a 5-second penalty. Alonso had lost a mirror. Somehow he got smashed. His car went flying, went into the wall. He kept the car going, completed a race. And then after the race, they said, oh, you're going to lose several grid spots because your car was unsafe. Now, they never forced him to bring his apparently unsafe car in. So they went back and forth. And I think they realized, you know what, we may have screwed up during the race, not having him come in, but it's foolish to sort of levy a penalty on him for an unsafe car after the race. And they reverted that, but they still haven't gotten a lot of the stuff sorted out. Like you said, maybe 10 seconds isn't enough. A lot of these things are racing incidents, especially on a first lap. The Riccardo Yuki incident was not, but that's when a lot of these happen. We understand that. And this is a highly competitive sport. But yeah, that's still kind of an odd issue where you are essentially rewarded for doing something you should not do. And we'll see in the off season how FIA addresses that. Now, speaking of all of this sort of oddness and craziness, Alonso, another great race, another DNF. I don't know what's up with Alpine, but I think, has anyone lost more points in the history of F1 than Alonso from just car reliability issues? I don't think so.
Yeah, probably not. But he's also started the most races of any driver in F1. So
true.
But yeah, it seems like the percentage is not in his favor. He made a deal with the devil to get that kind of talent. Unfortunately, his sort of career moves have failed him in several situations. So, tough season for him. He's still close to his teammate Ocon, who I think is also having a really nice season. And there's still, a few points ahead of McLaren, even after a really good Mexican GP for the McLaren team this season.
That's something that we need to address, because it seems incomprehensible to me that years into Zach Brown's overseeing of McLaren and getting all the sponsor money so they can't claim poverty, the McLaren is so bad. They're still behind Alpine. As we've said, Alonso has had multiple DNFs, Ocon as well, his teammate. And I just, it's like I said, it's inexplicable to me that the McLaren is this bad. I know Riccardo has had just a horrible season, so he hasn't helped the team much until this week. But I think that's one of the bigger stories this season is the failure of McLaren.
Yeah, I mean, McLaren was fourth in the constructors last season, behind, of course, Red Bull, Mercedes, and Ferrari, which maybe they should be closer to those teams. But they were 120 points ahead of Alpine last year. They're now, I think like 7 points back of Alpine currently.
Yeah, a few
with
behind.
2 races left. So, yeah, I mean, really disappointing kind of a step backwards for the McLaren team after kind of a bright season last year. We saw Lando Norris come on as a driver, and, he's one of the best drivers on the grid, I think, currently. And, you have Riccardo, who's a reliable and talented veteran driver. You expected coming into this season with new rules and regulations and all that money flowing into McLaren that they would be right up there with those top 3 teams. And they've taken a big step back.
I really thought McLaren would be close to the top 3. I did not expect them to overtake Red Bull or Ferrari or Mercedes, but be within striking distance. And they have not been close the entire year. As we said, except for this week, Riccardo has had a poor season, but it's just been a terrible season for the McLaren team. The fact that with notoriously awful reliability of Alpine, that McLaren is still behind them with just 2 races to go is that's a failure. That's a failure on McLaren's part. Speaking of failures, the opposite, Max, 14 wins now for the season. He now has the record. That's pretty astounding.
Unreal. I mean, he's younger than I am. And, he is climbing the leaderboards on, several different sort of statistical categories in the sport, with many years ahead of him. And, just another tip of the cap to him. He takes 14 race wins, 2 left, potentially for him, which, surpasses Seb Vettel and Michael Schumacher, 2 of the greatest drivers ever. I mean, he's admitted, like I think we mentioned before, there's more races in a season than there used to be. But I mean, still, to be as dominant as he has been, I think Lewis Hamilton, the most wins he's ever had in a season, was like 9 or maybe 11, something like that.
11.
In those dominant, Mercedes cars, racing against the likes of Bottas, who, we've repeatedly mentioned, just was there to come in second at Mercedes. It's pretty incredible what Max has achieved. And I think, maybe we haven't dogged Sergio enough for just being second place, like Bottas was. I mean, he hasn't put up any fight against Max this season. And the other teams, Mercedes and Ferrari, that can come close, just haven't had either the reliability or the pace that the Red Bull has.
I think, to be fair to Sergio, he has not come close to Max, but no one else has. Bottas was in a dominant car. Red Bull is running away with the constructors this year, but as we analyze the data on different tracks, on straights and curves, and different environmental settings, the Red Bull is not dominant the way the Mercedes was in the turbo hybrid era. So, I do think, it's fair to go after Sergio for just sort of not being in the same league as Max, but really I'm not sure anyone else is at this point. Maybe Lewis, maybe Alonso, Lando. It's tough to say, though. I think right now, there's no one at his level. Speaking of levels, who do you have for your top 5 for the Mexico Grand Prix?
I think this was an interesting race where not really too much happened, and most of it was expected. But I think you have to give it up to Max, dominating that race from start to finish, in qualifying, same deal, looked after his tires, was on the proper strategy, crushed everybody, and won his 14th of this season. So he's, I think, the clear number 1 driver today. Then I have Lewis, great drive, got off the line well, got past his teammate, held his ground. Those hard tires that they put on didn't necessarily seem like they were the right tires, but he held off Sergio and stayed within kind of reasonable distance to Max. I thought it was a really solid drive from him. I think he's been coming on late in this season, and I think he's really pushing hard to get Mercedes past Ferrari into that second place in the constructors. Then third, I have Daniel Ricciardo. I thought he had a great race, like we had mentioned. Just really put his foot down and got after it. Had a better race than his teammate. Passed all kinds of guys. I have him third because that crash with Yuki was 100% his fault. But he made up for it afterwards in terms of just sheer pace and time. So I have him third. Then I have Pierre Gasly in a crap AlphaTauri. He drove the beans out of it. Didn't quite get into the points, but I thought he had a really solid race and just stayed steady. He's a really good driver, and I think he's a really good pickup for Alpine next season. This year's kind of a wash for him, but I fully expect him to be in the points pretty consistently next year. And then finally, his teammate from next year, Esteban Ocon, I have fifth. I think Alonso easily could have gone here, but if not for an engine issue. But Ocon just quietly sitting up there, getting more points for Alpine, doing the job. I mean, he's just been solid all season. I think it's kind of hard to put him out of the question for maybe like top 7 or 8 drivers of the season.
Yep. Ocon is sort of Mr. Reliable. You don't hear about him much, and he's sort of overshadowed by Alonso. But he's always there. He's always in the thick of things. He always seems to do a good job and get as much out of this car as he can. So you have Max, Lewis, Ricciardo, Gasly, and Ocon. We don't discuss this beforehand, but our first 3 are the same. I have Max, as you said. He's already won his second title. He could take it easy, but he did not. An amazing qualifying, got on pole, won the race. It was never really in doubt. Has the record 14 wins in a season, Max Verstappen. Lewis Hamilton, my number 2. Lewis faltered in the beginning of the year. I think he was having difficulty with the car, struggling with all that porpoising issues. They couldn't quite get it set up to maximize his abilities. But really in the second half of the season, he's come on and he's the same old Lewis. Number 3, Riccardo. Riccardo's been such a disappointment this year, but this race, he was not going to be denied. And I've got him there at number 3. My 4th, Lewis's old teammate Bottas, driving in Alfa Romeo. That's not been a great car. He's not had a great season, but I thought he had a quality race this week. And my number 5, Alonso, always doing his best, always out there competing, always out there fighting. Once again, his car did him in, and he had a DNF. But I have Max, Lewis, Daniel Ricciardo, Valtteri Bottas, and Fernando Alonso. So, speaking of faltering, what is up with George Russell? He's still ahead of Lewis. 2 races to go. He might finish ahead of his teammate Lewis Hamilton. That's still possible. I don't know the exact number. I think he's about 10 or so ahead
15.
in the points. 15. Okay. And there is a sprint in the next race. So there's 2 races and a sprint. He was well ahead of Lewis in the first half of the season. Lewis has clearly outraced him in the second half. Is this just because Lewis Hamilton is Lewis Hamilton and the long grind of a season does not seem to wear on him? He brings his best every race. He's like Fernando Alonso. Or is there something else, do you think?
No, I mean, I think George is, in his F1 career, has never been anywhere close to the top. Lewis Hamilton, of course, has a number of championships to his name. He's won the most races of all time. And he's a true professional. And I think, he's worked really hard to get himself back in the season and in the conversation. And I think that it's just Lewis Hamilton is that good and that consistent and that passionate. And it's not like Russell has been bad. At least in my opinion, I don't think he's been bad. He's made a few errors here and there. Obviously, last week we saw with that crash with Sainz, but he's consistently in and around the top 5. For his first season at Mercedes, in a Mercedes that is not clearly the dominant car, I think he's done really well for himself. And there's, as good as Lewis has been in the second half of the season, there's a reason he's still not ahead of George. And I think that is because Russell has still been driving pretty well. But yeah, I mean, I believe that 15 points, Hamilton will make that up in the last 2 races plus sprint. And end up ahead of George.
That would be interesting, and it would be a disappointment for Russell, and a lot of fans might sort of diminish Russell, as you said. But I think this is more, Lewis Hamilton, one of the all-time greats. This is George's first year in Mercedes after a few years at Williams. That's a big jump. And even if Lewis somehow pulls ahead, I mean, George, I think, has done quite well. This is his first season in Mercedes. So I do think this is more a case of just Lewis Hamilton is so good and consistent, and it's George's first year with the team. Next year will be fun with both of them. George, his second year with the team, he's going to finish at worst, let's say, close to Lewis this year. And he's the future of Mercedes. Lewis is the past. So that's going to be a very fun dynamic, watching what happens in Mercedes. And not fun dynamic is watching what's going on at Ferrari. They were ahead at the start of the season. They had a car that clearly could compete. They have 2 very good drivers in Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz, and they seem to have given up. Mercedes is now only down by 40 with 2 races and a sprint to go. In And admittedly, Mercedes has gotten better every week. They've improved more, but I don't know what's going on with Ferrari. They really should be doing better, I think, than they are. Charles is a distant third to Max. Ferrari is distant second to Red Bull and could wind up in third place. This is a failure on Ferrari's part, a team-wide failure, I think.
Yeah, I mean, they were so good to start the season. And I know it's Ferrari and they're competing with Red Bull and Mercedes, so we should maybe manage our expectations. But when you saw how quick they were with really, really talented young drivers, Leclerc and Sainz, in winter testing, and then in the first, 3 races of the season, you're thinking this could go down to the wire. And after like maybe the 7th or 8th race of the season, you're like, no, they're done. There's no way they compete with Red Bull for the rest of the season. They could lose out to Mercedes, even though, we saw how really slow Mercedes was at the start of the season. They weren't really anywhere close. And they're only 40 points back of Ferrari. That is, I think that's a team-wide failure. We saw the pressure, I think, get to both Sainz and Leclerc at certain points this season. But they lost some points in that regard, but I think far more of the points that they lost from sort of winning positions was due to either reliability issues, strategy issues, poor pit stops, those kinds of things where it just nothing worked out in their favor. And I think, they'll have to take a look at themselves and figure out, we can engineer a fast car, a competitive car, but, we got to get these other things right. Where Mercedes and Red Bull thrive in those sort of situations or conditions, whatever you want to call them. And Ferrari really, really lacks in those areas.
Yep. Yeah, it's been, I think, as I said, a team-wide failure. I do think Charles and Carlos are great drivers, but I do think the pressure has gotten to them. I also think the frustrations from poor strategy, poor pit stops, maybe not developing the car week in, week out, the way, for example, Mercedes has the continuous improvements. I think that's gotten to them. And it's just been it's been disappointing, which, everyone loves Ferrari. Everyone loves Charles and Carlos. It's been disappointing. So switch to happier news, the virtual podium. So Max, Lewis, and Sergio on this week's Mexico Grand Prix podium. Who do you have on the virtual podium?
All right. So on my virtual podium, this is very silly, but Stanford, the University of Stanford, they, I don't know who it was at Stanford, but they made this 3D model of what God would look like based on sort of the phenotype features of that have been described of Jesus. So like what his father would look like. And you know what they came up with? If you look up this like 3D model that Stanford made of God, it looks exactly like Fernando Alonso. And that made me laugh. There were lots of memes about it. It's very funny. We always say Alonso made a deal with the devil, but maybe, he's just God and created everyone else in his image.
That's awesome. I'll have to give that a look. My virtual podium is Mexico. Mexico The Mexico Grand Prix signed a deal with FIA. They'll continue the race there, I think, through at least 2025. They always put on a welcoming show for the fans. We oftentimes get a fun race. This week's race was fun, albeit one lacking in surprise. But that's who I put on my virtual podium.
Awesome.
Okay, let's switch to the soft compound, Patrick. What do you think of Gunther Steiner? Because I am growing tired of his antics. They play well on Netflix Drive to Survive. He sort of became a bit of a mini cult figure. But the team continues to regress. They joined F1 several years ago and fought for a mid-pack spot. Now, the best they do is they fight and, realistically compete against Williams. Shockingly this year, because AlphaTauri is so inexplicably horrible, Haas is in 8th place, not 9th. But, they continue to plead poverty. Gunther never has any hesitation about blaming his drivers if they're at fault, especially the young Mick Schumacher. But I don't know. I'm tired of his antics. What about you?
Yeah, there's only so much a driver can do with a crap car, right? It's not like they can consistently get in the points in a car that's only, the 8th best car on track. There's just not much more I think the drivers can do. Sure, they've had a few moments this season. I really don't think that the drivers have done too many things that have caused or that have cost the team a lot of money or resources or anything like that. I think most of those issues were just either a poorly engineered car or poor reliability, or they got tagged by somebody else in either a racing incident or what have you. I don't think you can necessarily blame the drivers so consistently. At some point, you kind of got to look inward and figure that out. And if you're, pleading poverty, frankly, it's his job to go out and find sponsors, right? Bring in money then. I don't know what you want from anybody else. That's your job, right? So I would agree with you. I think it's been you can kind of look at the team and say, all right, we're only gonna be around 6th to 8th best, at best. But you can't be so consistently bad on every single track, and only because one of your drivers had a really great drive or you got kind of lucky, have you gotten those points. I think Gunther's time is limited at Haas, and frankly, I think it should be, because he, if the ship is sinking, he's at the head of it. That's his job. So,
yep, I agree. Okay, let's ask the stewards. Alonso made a highly provocative comment this week, claiming, in effect, that Max's 2 world championships are the equal, or perhaps the better, than Lewis's 7, because Lewis had a dominant car. Now, Alonso's correct in that Lewis had a dominant car. It was so dominant that for 7 years, Lewis really wasn't competing against any other team. He was competing only against his teammate. He took 2 out of 3 against Nico, and against Valtteri Bottas, he took all of them. But it's still a pretty impressive achievement. What do you think of Alonso's remarks?
I think that what Lewis accomplished is incredible. I think what Max has accomplished is incredible. And I think what Fernando said is to make himself feel better about his only 2 championships in a Renault to Lewis's 7, 1 with McLaren and 6 with Mercedes. I don't necessarily think too much about it. I know, fans can get really upset about certain comments that may or may not have been said. But ultimately, what Fernando said I don't believe takes away anything from what Hamilton has accomplished. And I think, everybody should look at what Max has accomplished and know that he is an incredible driver and will end up as one of the greatest drivers of all time in Formula One. And I think, Fernando can see that already. And, the Hamilton groupies will eventually, once they come to terms with the way 2021 finished.
Yeah, I agree that Alonso has several motives for making that statement, one of which is to make himself look better. I do think there is some truth to it, but only enough to sort of enrage Lewis Hamilton fans. Lewis Hamilton, he has the 7 trophies up there. He doesn't have to worry about what somebody else says. The other non-race story that garnered a lot of attention this week was the penalty against Red Bull for spending over the spending cap in 2021. They spent, after the books were reviewed, approximately $430,000 over the, I believe it's $135 million spending cap. That's less than 0.5%. And for this transgression, they were fined $7 million and will be receiving a 10% reduction in car development time, including in particular time in wind tunnel testing. Christian Horner, team principal for Red Bull, says it's draconian. The other team principals say, oh no, this is much too light of a sentence. What do you think, Patrick?
I think that Red Bull can easily pay a $7 million fine. That is chump change to them. So really nothing there. I think rather than sort of the FIA and F1, just gaining $7 million from Red Bull, that should be distributed among other teams. Look, these are who you competed against and you went over your cap. So, you actually have to pay out the other teams. I think that would be more reasonable. And rather than just that fine. But then the more sort of sporting penalty that they got, I think, it's hard to say. I'm not an engineer for an F1 team, so I don't know how significant that 10% sort of reduction will be. Red Bull is so good at making cars that I don't think they'll be too far off of those top teams, even with this penalty. I certainly don't think it's too much, or as Horner would say, draconian. the budget is there. The cap is there for a reason. If you go over it, then you're going to get penalized. I think really any punishment that they had handed out would have been justifiable.
I've got to say, we knock FIA a lot for a lot of either silly rules, confusing rules, sometimes a lack of transparency in how punishments are meted out. This case, I think FIA got it exactly right. I have been a big proponent of the spending cap here in the U.S. Putting a salary cap in NFL vaulted the league into the richest sporting league in the world by far. It makes all the teams highly competitive. Teams from small markets are able to compete against teams from larger markets. It makes for a much more fun, competitive, compelling sport. And I believe F1 has needed a spending cap badly for years. Mercedes was radically outspending everyone, then Red Bull, then Ferrari. No one else had a chance. A spending cap should allow much more competitive racing, which I think all real fans want. However, last year was the first full year, non-COVID year, where they instituted a spending cap. Accounting is already very difficult, and there are a lot of ways money can be moved about or allocated rightly or wrongly. F1 is an odd sport in the sense that you have teams like a Haas, for example, that don't make engines. You have true constructors and what I'll call companies. I don't want to diminish what they're doing, but they're more like buying a kit in a sense. Some companies are building power units, and the knowledge and the people and the movements of these efforts may impact a racing team in one way or another that's going to be difficult to account for. I had expected every team to be over the spending cap. I had expected there to be a great deal of confusion with the spending cap. The fact that only Aston Martin, with just a minor procedural issue, and Red Bull with less than 0.5% over, to me is actually a huge success for instituting the spending cap. However, Red Bull did go over, so I do think they needed to be punished and set as an example. I think the $7 million fine, they will feel that, and it puts the other teams on notice. And I think the 10% testing time is going to have a ongoing impact on their season next year and maybe beyond that. So I'm not sure what could be done better in this case. So I think that's one the FIA got exactly right. Okay, across the line, that is where we predict who will be on the podium at the next race. As the novelists say, this is the penultimate race. It will be in 2 weeks in Brazil. There is also a sprint. And then across the line, we make our selections. If our driver makes it on the podium, we get 3 points. If we choose correctly, we get 1 point for each correct choice. If they finish in the exact spot we predict, we get 3 points. Patrick, what are the current standings?
Yes. So my 4 points to your 2 this weekend. Yeah, pretty rough weekend for both of us. Puts me a full 3 points ahead of you going into the penultimate race, 77-74.
Nice. And it's so easy to explain across the line, yet every week I mis-explain it, which always makes me laugh. So we make our selections. If one of our drivers does make it in the top 5, we get 1 point. If they finish in the exact spot we predicted. That's 3 points. So up through Mexico, you have 77 points. I have 74, which means it's still anyone's to win.
Yep.
All right. So Brazil, who goes first this week?
You have first pick this week.
Okay. Well, then I already know who I want, because Brazil has been very, very good to Lewis Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton continues to get within striking distance of a victory. I say he gets his first victory of 2022 in Brazil.
Damn it.
I know. I knew you wanted
Lewis.
I know.
Nice. Good pick. All right. In that case, I guess I got to go with the hot hand. I'll take Max.
Yeah. No. This is the easy money right now. Lewis and Max. Okay. Second.
It's pretty much a 2-horse race at this point, this late in the season. Ferrari's down on power now. They've turned down their engines, it seems like, and Hamilton coming on strong, and the world champion Max has been so good all season. So I think we'll see another shootout in Brazil. P2 for me. That's a tough one. I will go with maybe that's a tough one. I'll take Max's teammate Sergio.
Okay, nice. This is, Red Bull has it all wrapped up. Max has the championship wrapped up. Red Bull has the constructors wrapped up, but they're not slowing down, and that's great to see. So you have Max and Sergio. I have Lewis, and in second, I will then take Lewis's teammate, George Russell. I get to choose third. I think Ferrari has packed it in. I'm sort of in agreement with you there. So I will go with a 1-2-3 all British team, Lando Norris in third.
Oh, nice. Interesting. This is tough then. For my P3, I think Ferrari's still the third quickest car on track. So I'll take Leclerc P3, get on the podium again. And then P4, no more reliability issues for Fernando. I'll take Alonso P4.
I don't know. I think that Alpine is done. We'll see.
He's the spitting image of God himself. I mean,
exactly. Funny. So Alonso in fourth. My fourth, I will take. Well, we talked about him, and it seems as if his Alpine is a bit more reliable. So I will go with Esteban Ocon in fourth. And in fifth, let's go with his teammate next year, Pierre Gasly. Gasly seems due, and I think AlphaTauri is going to try to finish out the year as even better than Haas.
Wow. I think that would be a crushing blow to Haas. That would be tough to take. So for that reason, I'm going to take Mick Schumacher P5.
Oh, that would be great if Mick got fifth in Brazil. I would love to see that. So our predictions for across the line for Brazil, I have Lewis, George, Lando, Esteban Ocon, and Pierre Gasly. And you have Max, Sergio, Charles Leclerc, Fernando Alonso, and Mick Schumacher. Awesome. Any crazy predictions for Brazil or the rest of the season?
Well, I was thinking about what would be crazy, and something really crazy popped into my head. Unfortunately, you took Lewis Hamilton across the line. There's nothing I could do about that. But my crazy prediction is that Lewis Hamilton wins in Brazil, And that begins his greatest reign at the top of Formula One in his career. He goes on to win 16 straight through to next season's summer break. So a win in Belgium next year starts the summer break, and then we come back in to the Netherlands, where he will finally not win a race.
I think that is a crazy prediction. I think Max is just too good. George wants to take Lewis's Mercedes crown from him. And Ferrari, I think, will stumble into a victory or two. But that would be quite something to watch in the twilight of his career, Lewis to have the best moment of his career. My crazy prediction is both Seb Vettel and Daniel Ricciardo will drive in F1 in a race next year. Maybe because one driver is sick, injured, or penalized, but I believe both of them will not be able to leave quietly, and they will desperately want to get back into F1. So that is my crazy prediction.
Nice.
All right. I want to remind our listeners, send your questions or comments to hardcompoundpod@gmail.com. We may read them on the show. We definitely will read them. And I wish to thank you for listening to everybody's most beloved father and son F1 podcast. And we are lights out.
See ya. Thanks for listening.